Okay, so what we've talked about so far is the origin of the universe, what the cosmos must have been like. Then we took a look at what the universe itself is like, what the world that was created looks like. We saw that it is incredibly complex. It seems that it's been geared towards life. Literally, there appears to be a purpose towards life. Life appears to be the centerpiece of all this incredible creation. Then we investigated the origin and complexity of life itself. And this really confirmed this intuition that there appears to be a purpose, there appears to be a plan. So the last piece of evidence we're going to see is if there is indeed a purpose to life, is there a purpose in life? Is there a right way things are supposed to be? So the questions we're going to be asking are, is there a purpose to life? If there is, then there's a right way to live. So we can further ask, is there a right way to live? And if there's a right way to live, then there's also a wrong way to live. Any other way is wrong by definition. And then some are going to say, this is just narrow-minded. And the fact is, this is really just a distraction. Whether it's narrow-minded or not really doesn't matter. What matters is if it is true or not true. If I'm an architect and I put together a floor plan of a house and there's only one doorway into the kitchen, then if someone tries to get into the kitchen by any other way, I can say that that's wrong. I'm the designer. I'm above and beyond them. This is the right way to get in. Any other way is going to be wrong. It's not designed that way. Or if I'm playing sports, there are designers who made certain rules for how the sport is supposed to be played. I can either play by that way, or if I try to play another way, then I'm playing outside of the rules. I'm going to get benched. So in these cases, not that it's narrow-minded so much as just that it's the reality. That's the way things are. So whether saying that there's wrong ways to live because there's a right way to live, because there's purpose, it's not so much that it's narrow-minded so much as whether it's reality or not. Is it true? If there's a purpose to life, then it doesn't matter what our opinion is, because it's there whether we like it or not, because there's a designer above and beyond us. The real question we're asking is there design? If there's a designer beyond us, then there is no purpose. And if there is no purpose, then there's no right way to live. If there's something that's an accident, there's no right way it's supposed to be. It's an accident. It shouldn't even have resulted. So if life is an accident, then there's no purpose. There's no right way to live. And if there's no right way to live, then there's no wrong way to live. So either there's a designer behind life, resulting in a purpose, a way life is supposed to be lived, or life is just an accident. There is no purpose by definition. These are the two worlds. The question is, which of these two worlds do we live in? To answer that question, we're going to ask, is there a purpose to life? Is there a purpose in life? How do we figure that out? We can just follow the chain. We can go a step lower. Is there a right way to live? If there's a right way to live, then any other way is wrong. So we can go a step lower again. Is there a wrong way to live? Which is what we're going to spend a lot of the time asking. Is anything objectively wrong? If objective moral law exists, there must be a standard beyond ourselves, an objective moral lawgiver. This is the moral argument for God's existence. So if it's not objective, if it's subjective, that means it's grounded in the subject. Now, if that's the case, then our view is no more valid than that of anyone else's. It's just a matter of opinion, of taste. I like chocolate, you like vanilla. There's no good, bad, better, worse. It's just different. If morality is subjective, then there is no right or wrong. There is just different. The problem is we treat certain behaviors as wrong. If morality is truly subjective, that's like throwing someone in prison for liking chocolate more than vanilla. We're just throwing someone in prison for having a different opinion than us. They didn't do something wrong, they're just different. Now, some claim that we invent words like good and bad to increase flourishing. Destructive behaviors prevent flourishing, so we try to stop those. But there's a problem with this. Why is flourishing good? Why is prevention of flourishing bad? You see, they must assume a standard to say these things. Good and bad are meaningless without a standard. So in order to say flourishing is good, in order to say prevention of flourishing is bad, they still need a standard, which must be elsewhere in order to justify flourishing. So if the standard is objective, then there's a purpose to life. If there's a purpose, if there's a plan, there's a planner behind life. God exists. But if the standard is subjective, each person is their own standard. So what they do cannot be wrong or punishable because it's just different from us. They are their own standard. I'm not really going to go into this, but really there's an even deeper problem. If this is an atheistic world, a world without purpose, if we're just moist robots, we're just following our own material programming. Ultimately, whether we destroy or promote flourishing, it's just in our programming. We ultimately have no free will. So that's like saying, oh, I'm a robot that destroys. I'm a machine that destroys. I'm a demolition machine. Or I'm a machine that builds, that puts things together. One is not better than the other. They're both doing what they were programmed to. They're just different. Ultimately, that's what we get to if this is an atheistic world. They're just different. There's no better or worse. Ultimately, we cannot compare different people or behaviors if morality is subjective, because each person is their own standard. There's no standard beyond them with which to compare them. Now, to understand this point, let's just talk about the three measures of temperature: Celsius, Fahrenheit, and Kelvin. Because I live in Europe, in Spain, I use Celsius. I know many of you are in the US, so you probably use Fahrenheit. And there are a few random people around the world, I'm not sure where, who use Kelvin. Now, it's kind of hard to translate between these three. If you try, you can, but it's kind of hard to do. Now, imagine that each person on the globe had their own measure of temperature. That would make this really difficult to talk about temperature, wouldn't it? But we can do that because ultimately we're measuring the same thing. So we can figure out how to translate it. Now, what if it's not just that everyone had their own measure? What if they're each measuring something different themselves? This makes translating, comparing, impossible, because not only are they using different measures, but they're measuring something different. And that's the point. If it's subjective, then we can never compare two different people. They're just different. With no standard beyond us, we can't compare. In order to compare, there must be something beyond us so that we can translate, so that we can bring two different things together. To understand this point, let's imagine that we're in space. And I say, hey, look, that's where my feet are pointing. Therefore, that's down. And you're off to my right, rotated 45 degrees. And you say, hey, look, that's where my feet are pointing. Therefore, that's down. And Fred is over on my left. He's rotated 277 degrees. He says, hey, look, that's where my feet are pointing. Therefore, that's down. If we ourselves are our only point of reference to ground something, then it's going to be different for each person. Instead, there must be a point of reference, a standard beyond all of us, in order for it to be objective, in order for it to truly hold outside of ourselves. Or one more analogy so that you can understand it is a compass. Let's imagine you have a special compass, but this compass isn't normal. It doesn't point north. Instead, it just points to you. That makes traveling really hard. You look at it, you turn, but it keeps pointing to you. You're never going to go anywhere. In other words, you have no direction outside of yourself. The problem is we do know there is a direction we ought to go in. We do know a quote unquote north. And yet we know we are failing to go that way. This is exactly why we can be held accountable for our actions. This is exactly why we can hold others accountable for their actions. We know what is right and we don't do it. So there is an objective standard. It's not just subjective, because we can compare different people. The question is, who or what is this objective standard? Where does this purpose come from? Some claim that it could be the result of evolution. But first and foremost, this is a category mistake. Now, just right off the bat, we already saw that macroevolution, Darwinian evolution, has lots of problems. You can see our latest video on evolution on our YouTube channel. But let's just assume that it does work. Could it get us morality? No, it's a category mistake. Evolution, if it occurs at all, is a material process. It deals with changing material living things. But morality is immaterial. You know, the law don't lie, it's not made of molecules. The law don't steal isn't made of amino acids. No, it's immaterial. So these are in two completely different domains. Second, evolution deals with biology, which is descriptive. It just describes what is. Whereas morality, it's prescriptive. It describes what ought to be. So once again, we see these are in two different areas. Next, biological processes can't make survival a moral right. If life is just an accident, we can have no such thing as a moral right to life. Next, survival isn't the highest moral virtue. In an evolutionary world, survival is the best thing. That's what it's all about, surviving, passing on my genes. But morally speaking, that's not the greatest thing. It's not all about survival. The highest moral virtue, morally speaking, is to lay down my life for others, which goes in direct conflict with what evolution is about, passing on my own genes. So once again, we see they're in two different areas. Next, morals from evolution actually can't be objective. Evolution is all about change, bringing about variation. So we expect everybody to have their own morality. We expect lots of variance. So once again, we'd find that it would be subjective. We already saw the problem with that. So objective morality can't be the result of evolution. Next, violations. So if we go against this quote unquote code within us, the product of evolution, are we actually doing something immoral? Or are we just doing something different? Did we actually do something wrong? Or is it just uncommon? Are we just a variant, an outlier? There's nothing truly wrong if life is just an accident. And this is just debris from evolution. Ultimately, we're just different. We're just variants, which is ultimately what evolution looks for. And lastly, cooperation isn't always best to survive. Some claim, oh no, because of evolution, we came together because that's better to survive, which is why we cooperate. That's why we help each other. But actually, dictators get by just fine. They have influence, they have power, they have wealth. Evolutionarily speaking, they're in a great spot. But morally speaking, they're in a terrible spot. We know that what they do is immoral. So once again, we see these are in two different domains, two different areas, even going in two different directions. So evolution cannot explain this objective morality. What about social conditioning? Could it just be a social construct? No. Once again, there's an important distinction here: epistemology and ontology. Now, epistemology deals with what it is to know, how we know. Ontology deals with what actually exists. Now, how we know something, where we learn it, does that dictate whether it's true or not? Not necessarily. I can learn something from my parents, I can learn something from my teachers, I can learn something just by reasoning myself. That doesn't dictate whether something's true or not. You know, have you ever heard someone and you listen to them, it's like, I'm not so sure that's true. Maybe it was even a teacher. Or even if you learned something from an unreliable source, then does that mean it's untrue? No, sometimes it does turn out to be true. The fact is, where you learn it from doesn't dictate whether this is actually something that is true or not. So even if we were to learn our morality from a society, does that dictate whether an objective moral law exists or not? No, not necessarily. Once again, these are two different areas, epistemology and ontology. Where we learn something doesn't dictate whether that something actually exists or not. Next, there's another important distinction: sociology and morality. Sociology, like biology, is merely descriptive. It describes what is, it describes what the society is like. Morality, on the other hand, describes what ought to be. It often says, oh no, society actually isn't that great. It ought to be better. It ought to be different. What they're doing right now is immoral. It's wrong. So you see, these are in two different areas. These are going two different directions, once again. Next, some people often say that, oh no, but morality around the world is actually different. That proves it's just based on societies. But actually, no, it's not all that different. What's different is social conventions, because they're made up, so they could be different. Social conventions around the world are different, like driving on the right side of the road or on the left side of the road, or what clothing is deemed acceptable. Those are conventions, social conventions. They could be different, but morality is not. There's not a country in the world in any time period in which running away from a battle has been deemed a moral virtue, or lying to your parents has been a moral virtue. Morality actually is pretty fundamentally the same everywhere from all time. It's merely social conventions that have been different. And if it weren't, then we could never judge any other group from any time period. It's like, oh no, that was right for them at that time period. No, it's because we know that morality is actually a thing. If we can say, oh no, what they did wasn't right. Not now, not then. And lastly, to judge between different people and society's opinions, there must be a standard, an objective standard beyond them with which to judge them with. Let's imagine I'm playing piano. I'm trying to figure out which of these two keys is the right one to play right now. Now, what do I need to use to figure out which of them is right? Another key on the piano? Another person or society in this case? Is that going to help me? No, it's just going to show another one that's different. And ultimately, if all I have are the different keys, then there is no one that's right or wrong. They're just different. But if I'm looking for which one is right, if a such thing as a right key does exist, then I need something beyond the keys to tell me which one is right. for the moment. I need either sheet music or a piano teacher to come and tell me. There must be something beyond the keys, beyond the piano, to tell me which key is right. Otherwise, there's no truer or better. There's just different. In fact, as both of these views, evolution and social conditioning, actually have a more fundamental problem. These views must assume moral terms in order to try and ground morality. They say things like flourishing and life are good. Once again, this just pushes it back a step. Why are they good? By what standard? We know there is a standard. That's why we can assume things to be good or bad. That's why we know that flourishing and life are good. But the question is why? Why are they good? Ultimately, there must be a standard beyond us. Otherwise, it's just our opinion against the Nazis' opinion. If there's no objective moral law, all is permitted. I'll say that again, all is permitted. That's a scary thought. If God doesn't exist, then nothing is truly wrong. You have no choice but to live in a world where torturing babies for fun is just a matter of preference. Say chocolate. I like chocolate. I like torturing babies for fun. That's just my opinion. That's my preference. That may not be your opinion or your preference. That's okay. You don't have to do that. But I'm going to do that because that's what I like. There's nothing truly inherently wrong about it. As Dr. Frank Turek said, let me go out on a limb and suggest that if your worldview requires you to believe that raping children, murdering children, eating children, and slaughtering 6 million innocent people is just a matter of opinion, then you have the wrong worldview. Indeed, to try and deny a mind behind the universe, to try and deny a purpose, a right way to live, you have to assume that there is no such thing as a wrong way to live, that nothing is truly inherently wrong. Nothing. Not murdering children, not raping children, none of the above is actually wrong. And if you have to believe that in order to uphold your worldview, then you have the wrong worldview. That's a delusion. That's a sickening belief. You need to find a new worldview that doesn't make you deny these things that we know to be inherently obvious. So Frank Turek went on to say there would be no book to know unless there's an author. We know this quote unquote book. We know this moral law. The question is, who is the author? So just to sum up what we've looked at, we know there's a wrong way to live. That means there's a right way to live. That means there's an overarching purpose. There's a mind, a lawgiver behind it all. The fact is, we don't even need to make the case that everything's objectively right or everything's objectively wrong. If just one thing exists that's objectively wrong, such as torturing babies for fun, then an objective moral law exists. And if just one objective moral law exists, an objective moral lawgiver exists, God. Now, some would say, okay, so I understand that we can't ground morality in any of those other things, but doesn't God make the same mistake? How can we ground morality in God? Why is what God commands good? This is the good old Euthyphro dilemma presented by Aristotle. He said there are only two options. God commands something so it is good, which means he's arbitrary, he's just making this stuff up. Or God commands something because it is good, in which case there's a standard beyond God which he must look to. But actually there's a third option, and that is God commands something because he is good. He himself is goodness. He is the standard. It's his nature, and his will by necessity expresses his nature. Just as it's my nature to enjoy writing, so my will is going to express that. I'm going to want to write. I'm going to write. In the same way, goodness is God's nature, so what he commands is going to reflect that. It's not that he's making something up. It's not that he has to look for something outside of himself. It's that he himself is the standard, and his will is going to reflect that. He himself is good, and what he commands is going to reflect that. He is the ground of all reality, is the standard, and the closer we are to him, the better we are. Imagine that you're in a studio, and a singer is recording his new album. Now, a couple weeks later, when it comes out, you buy it on 3 media, some old ones, a record, a tape, and a CD, none of which are currently in use, unless you're like me and you actually still use CDs. And you're going to see which one of them is the best. The best one is the one that sounds the most like the original, most like the actual recording of the guy in the studio. It's the same with God. The closer we are to the original, the better we are. The closer we are to the standard, to his goodness, the better we are. So what we found so far is that only minds give purposes. we found that the purpose in life does indeed exist. And over the past few weeks, we found that a mind exists behind the universe and life. Therefore, we are subject to its purpose. The question is, will we obey? Now, there's one more question I want to address that's often asked. Can an atheist be good without God? And it really is a simple answer, but I feel like I need to answer it because it's just asked so often. And if you've never thought about it before, it can be hard to answer. So can an atheist be good without God? I don't like when the question is presented this way because it really brings two things together that really need to be distinguished. Belief in God is not necessary to do good. For example, let's just say I don't believe that cleaning up the world is actually possible. Does that mean I can't recycle? No, not necessarily. To be able to, yeah, I can recycle. I don't have to believe in it in order to do it. You might say, you don't really have a reason to, or maybe you have reasons, but they're not good reasons. Maybe it just makes you feel better, maybe it makes other people feel better, so that's why I do it. But I don't need to believe it in order to live according to it. That's not a perfect analogy. The point is, you don't need to believe in something in order to live according to it. Belief in God is not necessary to do good, but there would be no such thing as good unless there's an objective standard. There'd be no such thing as good unless God exists. So the existence of God is necessary for anything to be good or bad. So can an atheist do good without believing in God? Yeah, of course. But there's no such thing as good if God does not exist. So in that sense, they're living on borrowed capital. So an atheist can be good without believing in God, but they cannot be good if God does not exist, because there's no such thing as good in that case. As Dr. William Lane Craig said, belief in God is not necessary for objective morality. God is. Or as Dr. Greg Gansel explained, in light of the atheistic commitment that the world is accidental, there is little reason to think that there is a way things ought to be. There can only be a way we want things to be. But what this idea captures is our preferences. Our preferences do not ground objective purpose or value. A way things ought to be implies some kind of overarching purpose or goal. There can be no such purpose or goal unless there's someone to have the goal. So once again, we see that there's a wrong way to live, there's a right way to live. There's a right way to live, there's a purpose. If there's a purpose, there's an overarching purpose goal, then there's someone to have that goal. There's a mind behind the universe. Or as Dr. Richard Taylor said, the concept of moral obligation is unintelligible apart from the idea of God. The words remain the same, but their meaning is gone. So we see once again, for the existence of these entities, God must exist. So just what we found, we know that there is right and wrong. There's a right and wrong way to live. Therefore, we know there is indeed purpose. Now, this only makes sense if there's someone behind it all, if there's a mind, if there's a planner behind life. And to claim anything else goes against our most obvious intuitions. To try and escape this mind, to try and escape this purpose, you're going to have to deny the existence of right and wrong. You have to deny that things are objectively wrong. And that goes against everything that we find intuitively obvious. So in this case, any argument you make for atheism is going to be less obvious than the clear intuitions we have for theism, that there is indeed an objective moral law. Certain actions are actually wrong. It's not just my opinion. It's not just our opinion as humanity, but that certain actions are indeed objectively wrong. There's something seriously wrong about that action, that behavior. So knowing all this and just where we've come all the past few weeks, we found the origin of the universe, the complexity of the universe, the origin and complexity of life, up to the right way to live life, that there is indeed purpose to life, to our life. There's a plan and purpose to yours and my life. That the mind behind the universe, he just set everything in motion, but he's much nearer than we thought. And that he has a plan for our life. So this is a perfect example of how apologetics is just about far off concepts, about a far off being, but it gets close, it gets personal. It tells us how we're supposed to live our lives, which is something we ask ourselves every day. How am I going to live my life? These answers actually do change life. They actually do matter.